tonight's virtual class. We're going back to the basics, fishing basics tonight. So I'm Chris Hearn. I'm the West Tennessee field rep of Tennessee Wildlife Federation, raised over here in West Tennessee and been fishing since I was probably 6 or 7 years old. And as far back as I can remember, I remember riding, going fishing with my uncle and being quizzed over different conditions and water clarity and all these different things. And he had asked me, well, what kind of lures are you going to tie on today? And, you know, I just learned so much back then. And then through just personal experience, I've been able to hopefully get you guys started on the right track of fishing. But this class is really going to be going back to just the very basics. And, you know, that is a very broad subject. So I've done the best I could with the material we're going to cover tonight. It's not a very lengthy presentation, really. It's going to leave plenty of room for questions. And I think that's really where we need to be is, you know, hearing from you guys what you want to take away from this. But we're going to cover common fish species that you might be fishing for in Tennessee, all the different types of rods and reels, and a little bit of which ones might be better for different scenarios. There's really about 3 different main line types, and we're going to talk about the qualities of those. We're going to dive a little bit into some lures and baits for different species of fish, and then we're going to talk about where to find fish on individual reservoirs, and also kind of on a macro scale, finding a place to fish near you. And in the same boat there, some of the tools we're going to be using to do that. We'll also be able to show you some regulation stuff. So we'll walk you through all that stuff. Let's start off with just talking about common fish species. And the first, I titled it as brim, because at least over here in West Tennessee growing up, when we went brim fishing, you know, we were targeting red ear and bluegill and some of the different sunfish, but, you know, we were brim fishing. And to me, those several little species kind of encompass that brim family there. But brim is one of the most plentiful fish in Tennessee, found pretty much in any body of water. We're going to talk a little bit about beds, and all fish go and they bed, but brim in particular, when they bed and spawn in the spring, it'll be coming up really starting right now as this moon begins to get back full. There'll be a big push of brim pulling up to spawn. And what they'll do, they'll find about 2 or 3 foot of water, and there's going to be a whole bunch of them go up there. The hens will lay the egg. I mean, the females will, I got turkeys on the brain. The females will lay the eggs, and then the males will come in and they'll guard them. And that's normally what you're going to be catching. The male in this species is a little bit bigger. So that's a little bit about brim. Normally, we're talking about throwing red worms or some kind of small artificial bait, maybe crickets, when we're talking about brim fishing. For crappie, again, this is a very plentiful fish found in most of your reservoirs across Tennessee. They're a little bit bigger than brim as far as their size. You know, a lot of your creel size limits in different places will be around 10 inches. So, you know, that's a pretty good size chunk of meat on a crappie. Again, they pull up in the spring to spawn. They're probably kind of on the backside of their spawn, at least as far as us catching them. But normally found around structure, and depending on the time of year, again, up normally pretty shallow in the spring and fall, and then sometimes they'll get out quite a bit deeper in the fall and winter. When we're crappie fishing, we're normally throwing a mid-sized bait, still, you know, 2 inches or less. Minnows would be your number 1 live bait for crappie. Then that brings us to bass. You know, most of the time when we think about bass, we're thinking about artificial lures. You know, there's three really common subspecies of bass, which is your spotted bass, smallmouth, and largemouth. Most of your non-river type tributaries are going to be largemouth. When you get into some current, you're going to start getting into some more spotted bass and smallmouth bass. Largemouth on the big side is going to be, anywhere from a big one would be between 6 and 12, 14 pounds. With that being pretty uncommon, when you get up, especially in the double digits. Smallmouth, a 4 or 5 pound smallmouth is a really big one. 3 or 4 pound spotted bass is a really big one. Again, if you're fishing with live bait, probably minnows would be your number one pick, but there is a ton of bass lures out there, anything from topwater to spinnerbait to different worms, and we're just going to real quickly skim through some of them later, and I'll answer any questions, but that would lead us down a rabbit hole that would take all night. And then probably the most common and easiest to fish for when you're starting out fishing is catfish. These fish are bottom feeders. They use their whiskers to feel vibrations and feel around and on the bottom. They're normally eating worms. People use chicken livers. You can buy that in the meat department of just about any grocery store, and you're throwing out on the bottom. You just kind of use patience to your advantage. Again, these fish, like right now, especially on the river systems, are pulling up in the rocks and things like that to do their spawning. And then they'll move back out into some deeper water. But really, when they're feeding, they're not in super deep water. They move up to where most of the feed is, and that's where you would target them. So any questions about the species that you might be fishing for in Tennessee before we dive into rods and reels? Okay, so let's start talking about rods and reels type. This is a what I would call a push button or a casting reel. Generally, now they do make them in all sizes. A Zebco 303 or a Zebco 33, like what you see pictured here, is, and I think almost everybody starts out fishing with one of them. They're very easy to use. Basically, you're going to push that button, hold it down, and then when you get to the forward part of your cast, you're going to let go of the button with your thumb, and that lure is going to go out there using the energy of that rod. So they do make casting rods and reels in several different weights and sizes. They make some really small that you can throw some pretty light baits on if you're brim fishing or crappie fishing. And then they make some even bigger, Zebco 404s or 44s that, would be stout enough to probably hold a pretty good sized bass or catfish. What you'll find is the quality and the smoothness of the reel is normally not going to be what it would be with a spinning reel or a bait caster. Oftentimes they have a pretty slow speed of retrieve. So in other words, if I'm throwing a bait caster that's pretty fast, every time I make one turn, I get like 5 or 6 inches of line. I find that a lot of the time with a casting reel, it's almost just 1-to-1. You don't have any gear ratio to help speed that up. But I'm sure there's some different ones out there that could, be a little bit better quality. But to me, this is entry level. And then once you kind of get the hang of that, I would move on up through the different rods and reels. So next is going to be a spinning rod and reel. This is the one, if you've ever looked at Walmart, the eyes are a little bit bigger. That's because the way the line goes around the spool on a spinning reel. Couple takeaways, I've seen people reel these things every type way possible. So a lot of times they'll turn it what winds up being upside down. So reel up and reeling backwards to reel these spinning reels. But the way they should be used is the reel stays down from the rod. It kind of gets confusing because you look at right-handed or left-handed rods and reels. Most of the spinning reels, you can swap the handle to either side just by undoing a screw. But in theory, if you're right-handed, you should reel with your left hand. Now, I see it always. It's personal preference, but if you really think about it, if you if you are gonna use your dominant hand, your right hand, you're gonna want that to cast. If you had the reel on your right hand, you would lose a little bit of efficiency by swapping the left hand to your rod to reel then. And I say all that, and it's almost exactly the opposite on a bait caster, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So any questions about casting rods and reels or spinning rods and reels so far? Spinning rods and reels, we're going to talk a little bit about rod weights, but spinning is what I use when I'm throwing really light lures. If I'm throwing an 1/8 ounce head or a 1/4 ounce head and I'm wanting to throw it a long ways, I'm normally using like a 7/6 medium light rod with a small size spinning reel. I see somebody raise their hand. You can use you can use that Q&A function to ask any questions that you need to. Just click it on your toolbar there. Landon asked a pretty good question. What's a good species for first-time kids to fish for? Man, especially right now, brim would be a great way to get kids hooked. What I would look for, you can actually go back and see the brim fishing video, or just send me an email and I can send you that link that I done a couple weeks ago. But this is a time when those brim are pulling up to go in bed, and when you find them, I mean, you can catch one every cast. So it's hard not to have a good time when they're like that. Landon asked, would rivers or lakes be best? You know, it's just really about whatever you're closest to and kind of what species you're wanting to fish for. And I mean, not all rivers and lakes are built the same. You know, you'll just have to start trying some different ones. If I was going to a river, I would be targeting probably smallmouth and spotted bass, things like that. And then if I was going to a lake, I'd probably target brim, maybe bass. Catfish could be in either one, just depends on the size of the river. So let's move on and we'll talk about a bait caster. Really, when we're talking about bait casting, we're talking about fishing for bass because it lets you fish so much more efficiently. You can make long casts with a lot of different lure weights. Normally when we're bass fishing, we're throwing a little bit bigger bait because we're after a little bit bigger fish. And then also when you're catfishing, you really can use any rod and reel catfishing, but I think really the biggest use for a bait caster is going to be for bass fishing. The downside of that might be they are a little bit more expensive. And if you've ever heard somebody say backlash, what happens is you're completely controlling how fast that spool that has the line comes off with your thumb. So there's some settings on the reel that you can put tension down on the spool to make it where it don't spin as easy. So that's obviously going to help you not backlash. But if you loosen that up to where you are able to efficiently make long casts, you're going to have to use your thumb to keep that thing from keeping spinning and getting slack. So, there's a ton of videos out there on YouTube about learning how to fish with a bait caster. But once you do, kind of get that figured out, it is just really a smooth and efficient way of fishing. And again, that's when we're talking about throwing a little bit larger baits. You're going to need something up 3/8 ounce or a 1/2 ounce just to be able to throw most of your bait caster rods and reels. Edward asked, doesn't it affect the population when you're taking the males off the bed? Well, yeah, I mean, it could, but it's been going on for a long time and it hadn't hurt any of the brim populations. But if you look at it from a conservation standpoint, taking the males would not be near as bad as taking the females. There's one male can fertilize a lot of different eggs, but one female can only lay so many. So, all right, let's dive into some rod weights. I know that it can be very confusing if you're going out there, whether you're picking a casting rod, spinning rod, or a bait casting rod. You're going to be asking yourselves, which one do I need, how long, what action. So I'm going to do my best to describe what that means when you're looking at the rods and you see on the rod or on the tag it says heavy, medium, or light, and it can be either in between. So let's go left to right. A heavy action rod is going to be a very stiff rod, and you can kind of see the illustration. Big fish, big lures. It's all about the backbone kind of midway down that rod. And then what would be next, coming from heavy to light, would be a medium heavy. That's halfway between a heavy and a medium. This is something I'm going to use when I'm throwing, maybe a half ounce bait, spinner baits, crankbaits, things like that. When I get down into a medium, then you can start throwing, in a spinning rod, you can throw, corks with, live bait rigs, slip floats, 3/8, quarter ounce stuff. And then when you start getting down into that 1/8 ounce and smaller, you're normally going to get down to a medium light or a light action rod. And then what you're also going to see on that rod is going to be, it's going to say something like medium fast. And that's going to be a medium action with a fast action tip. And basically, this is just going to kind of influence the way that rod transfers that energy when you're casting. That's what I like to think of. It'll affect a little bit about the way maybe an artificial lure moves. So generally speaking, the heavier action are going to have some faster tips. But a medium light and a moderate action tip is a really good kind of brim fishing, crappie fishing rod. That's where I like to live. If you're only going to pay attention to one thing, pay attention to the rod weights, the heavy, medium, or light, more than the action of the tip. Any questions on rods and reels? And then the next thing we're going to talk about is line. I see a couple of you guys raised your hand. You'll have to use the Q&A function there. Just type in any question you got. Nicole asked a question, what is the price difference from heavy to light rods? You bring up a good point about price and quality and things like that. You're not going to find a lot of price difference in the different weights of rods, so heavy or light. Sometimes you might find that medium to medium heavy rods are a little bit more expensive, but you also got to think that they're bigger, beefier rods, and they take a little more material to build. So I can kind of see where that might be the case. But generally speaking, when you're talking about price of rods, you're not really going to have an influence of, medium or medium light or something like that. It's just going to be the brand and the model of those rods. So, most rod manufacturers, I use Denali rods most of the time. Them, for example, they've got about 4 different tiers of quality of rods. They're all great rods, but you've got some, that's coverts that are $170, $180 a piece. You've got their ambush series that's somewhere around 80. You've got a panfish series that's 40 or 50 bucks. So not only is there different prices as far as your different manufacturers, but normally a manufacturer will have different tiers. And what they're doing that's kind of driving the price is it's a lot to do with the graphite that goes into it. If you ever hear somebody say something like a IM5 or IM6, IM8 blank, that's to do with the graphite that's used. Generally, you're getting more rod, as in long rod or, a good feeling tip and action, and it's still very light. It's light to the hand, not lightweight, but, it's just lighter. Corey asked the question, what weight is best for small kids? They make I guess I could run through just kind of what I see when it just depends on the kid. But, I carried a 4-year-old back about 2 weeks ago, and I gave her a casting rod. It was like a 4.5, 5 foot medium or a ultralight little casting rod with a cricket and a float, for brim. So that's kind of where I would be for a 4, 5, 6 year old. As you get up 7, 8, 9, you could go to a little bit bigger rod. You could probably go to like a 6 foot light action or medium light, still probably a casting reel at this point when they're that young. And then once you get a kid up into that 10 to 12, 14 years old, they definitely could learn to throw a spinning rod and reel, or you could start them out with a casting rod and they're just able to handle a little bit longer rod at that point. So, it really has to do with the age and the size of the kid. Good questions. Let's move over into line, and when we get to the end, if there's any questions of stuff that I haven't covered, we can definitely circle back. But really, when we're talking about fishing line, we're talking about 3 main types. We're talking about monofilament, fluorocarbon, or braid. Now, each one has its own qualities and benefits to why you might use one over the other. And on this next slide, you're going to see a pretty wordy chart of kind of good, bad, and ugly of each one. That being said, this is a fishing basics virtual class. I'm going to say for the first several years of your fishing career, you can get by with monofilament. Just go and buy a 10-pound test, monofilament, put it on whatever rod you're using, and then as you learn more about fishing and you learn how different lines can benefit you, then you can start experimenting with some of the others. But just real quickly, this is some of the things that you might look for in different fishing lines. One, monofilament is cheap. If you make a long cast and you hadn't got a way of retrieving your lure and you got to break that off, well, you're not breaking off a whole lot of line or a whole lot of expense there. Fluorocarbon is probably the highest priced. Braid is somewhere kind of in the middle, I would say. And then here's something pretty important, the buoyancy of the line. So monofilament floats, fluorocarbon sinks, braid floats. So if I'm throwing a topwater lure for bass, I wouldn't want to use fluorocarbon because it's going to make the line's going to sink and it's going to make that bait not act like it should. That being said, if I'm throwing something that requires me to work the lure and I'm making a long cast, that stretch plays a pretty big factor. Monofilament has high stretch. It's almost like a rubber band to an extent. That's kind of good in fighting a fish because you can keep constant pressure on them and not having to completely depend on the rod to keep the pressure on a fish as you're fighting it. But the stretch, what it'll do is, like with braid, I can throw a lure and just barely move my rod tip and make that lure move however I need to, where I'm going to have to work a little bit harder over the course of a day when I'm using something like monofilament. One very, very important thing to remember, braid is very, very strong for its diameter. I can take 20-pound braided fishing line and it's going to be about probably even smaller than 1/10 the size of 20-pound monofilament. It has got a very high tensile strength. It is very abrasion resistant as well. So in other words, I can throw it into cover, I can get a nick on the line and still be able to get a fish out of it. Edward asked what type of line is used for fly fishing. Generally speaking, you're going to have your fly line and then you're going to have a leader, whether it be 8, 10, 12 foot, and normally that leader is made of fluorocarbon because a lot of the areas that you're fly fishing in, some of your clear water rivers and creeks, They're very clear, and that is one thing you can see there. Fluorocarbon, the visibility of it is very low. Good questions. Any other questions around line? The only thing I really seen on this chart that just kind of threw me a loop is they've got abrasion resistance is very high for fluorocarbon, and I would almost find that to be the opposite. I find it if you ever get a nick on it, it just really reduces the strength of it. So that would be the only thing that I would probably pay a little bit of attention to as far as something on this chart. All right, we'll move on, but feel free to ask questions as they come to you. So we could spend easily 2 or 3 hours just discussing all the different rigs that could possibly be used for all the different species, all the lures and baits. And, I just thought, well, how can I fit all this into a 1-hour virtual class? And what would I want to know if we're just talking about basics? And number one, you're going to want to rig up some kind of a bobber rig. I went ahead and pictured this one because you've got a hook. Let's say you come up 8 inches, you've got a split shot. The split shot is going to be determined by the size of your float or kind of what you're fishing for. If I'm fishing for brim, I'm probably using like a 1/4 ounce or a really smaller than that, 1/8 ounce split shot, and then a pretty small float. The key to any kind of float fishing is getting the right size split shot with the float. Obviously, if you put too large of a split shot and throw it out in the water, it's just going to sink your float. If you put too light of a split shot, it could affect how far you can cast it, and it also might not make your float set up right like it's supposed to. Like on this one, think of it like this. The water line should be about that red and yellow line where it meets. So that bobber would be setting straight up. Now, I always cover the slip float rig is what I call it. And you can use it's called a rubber bobber stopper. I think you can get like 100 for $3 off Amazon. I use the rubber ones. There's also some like line that you would run it through and pull both sides. Bunch of different ones, bobber stopper or stop knot. You could easily look up some videos or Google those and get that. Depending on the size of the hole in your bobber, you might need a bead. The bead's purpose is on a slip rig like this, when the lure sinks and the bobber obviously stays on the surface, it's going to stop at that stop knot or that bobber stopper, and the bead is going to keep that knot from going through your bobber. That makes sense. And then also there's also clip-on floats, clip-on bobbers. So if you didn't want to go this route, you could just put a hook, come up 8 inches, crimp your split shot on, and then whatever depth you're wanting to fish, you can just clip your bobber onto that, where I can adjust my depth pretty quickly with something like a slip float rig by just adjusting where my stop knot is. So that is one of the most basic, most used rigs for really catfish, crappie, brim. If you were catfishing with it, you would want to let it dangle down pretty close to the bottom. But we had a couple questions here going back to the line. So clear water, you want less visible line? Yeah. So especially if you got some reservoirs that's getting fished a lot, you don't want the fish to be able to see your line. And then what line is best for largemouth bass? It is just completely about what scenario you're doing and what lures you're throwing. If I'm throwing heavy cover, like maybe a worm, a Texas rig, I think I've got that pictured here in a minute, into a lot of structure, whether that be around docks or brush piles or things like that that's in the water, I'd probably use braid. Other than that, I would probably just stick with monofilament. So we'll move on to the next very common rig, and this is called a Carolina rig. This is going to be your number one rig for fishing for catfish. You're going to have an egg weight. So depending on how deep the water is or how much current there might be, we could go to a little bit bigger one, but I'm going to say a 1/2 ounce egg weight would be a good all around starting point for you. The protective bead in this case is to protect that knot on your barrel swivel when that lead sinker is beating on it. If you're using monofilament or braid, I wouldn't find that to be just very important. If you got some beads, yeah, put it on there, but you could definitely get by skipping that, just going straight from, having your egg weight on your main line and just tying on the swivel. Before you do that, if you don't have a spool of line, you got to cut your leader line off. You can use the same line that you're using for your main line. You just have to have it separate. Normally, I like to run for catfish about a 12 to 14 inch leader. So I'm tying to my barrel swivel and then going down to my hook. So there's some really cool things that take place under the water with this Carolina rig. One, if you're fishing in current, you can throw down current from your position. Let the egg weight go to the bottom, right? And then if you give it just a little bit of slack, the egg weight is going to move, is going to stay on the bottom, but the line will actually come further below the bait and let it get a real lively, realistic motion of moving in the current. If you're fishing in still water, you're able to throw it out there. Just keep your rod, set down your rod if you're catfishing. Just set it down, put it in a rod holder, whatever the case, and you're just going to watch that rod tip. And when a fish gets it, there's nothing keeping that fish from pulling directly on your rod tip because the line's going to slide through that egg weight. So when a fish hits it, it could just be a tap, 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 or if it's a catfish that's already got it and running, you'll just see your rod bow over, and you can pick it up and set the hook. You can see shaped here. This is kind of like an octopus shaped hook, octopus style hook. This is a good catfish hook, and we're going to cover a little bit about all the different type hooks in there, but I did pick that one for that very reason, because it was a hook that I would probably use for catfish. Nicole asked a question, but I ain't sure I'm a good weight for the egg weight. I would say about a 1/2 ounce. That would be a good starting point. And then you could go bigger or heavier depending on the depth and the current and things like that. But to me, 1/2 ounce normally is all I really use when I'm catfishing. And also the size of the bait would play a little bit of a factor, but I find a 1/2 ounce, I can throw it on a medium heavy rod and, rear back and throw it a mile if I need to, just cast really good. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the different live baits that you might be using for the different species. So I mentioned earlier for brim and catfish, we would normally use worms. With catfish, you can get by with night crawlers. If you go buy night crawlers at Walmart now, it'll be like 12 to a box and they're huge. Even with catfish, I would only use about a 1/2 of one of those big giant worms. You're going to be using a little bit bigger hook for catfish. One thing I like to do, me and my grandfather, when we're fishing at the river with worms, we'll put a section of night crawler on the hook, but then we will take like a red wiggler or something like that and leave about an inch on each end of it and kind of middle hook it through the body. You're going to kind of sew it on there a little bit, but leave enough that when it gets in the water, it's got both ends that's kind of moving. So you're using that night crawler body as a bulk for the bait, and then you're getting motion out of those red worms or red wigglers. For brim, we're normally talking about either red wigglers, which are kind of small, hooking them, like I said, you hook one kind of through the middle of the body, run it through at about 2 inches, keeping it kind of just pushing it up on the hook, and then that's going to leave both ends to move when it gets under the water. And then also crickets is a great brim live bait. And then when we're talking about bass or crappie, we're normally talking about minnows. There's a couple different ways to hook those. If you're fishing in still water, there is no current, there's not a lot of wind, and you're going to throw it out there and just let it set. I normally hook my minnow through the back. If you're fishing in current, or if you're going to be throwing it and reeling it and throwing it and reeling it, and you're not just going to completely let it set, I would probably hook it through the mouth like you see pictured here, hook it under the chin, kind of out between the eyes. The reason being, if you hook it through the back or the tail in current, or if you're reeling it, you're pushing that water backwards through the gills as it's not intended, and it'll normally kill your minnow pretty quick. And you want it to, stay alive down there trying to call up a fish as long as possible. Robert asked a question about hook sizes, and I'm going to cover some of that on the next slide. Normally, I wouldn't use a bluegill for bait, but if you was fishing for big giant bass or something, and you were able to use a bluegill, I would probably hook it through the back. How to hook a cricket? If you can see pictured there, you've got that little thing in the back. I guess that I missed that day in college where they talked about the different parts of the insects, but I think the back end there, you're going to put the point of the hook through there and thread on the whole cricket coming out somewhere up kind of in its chest between all its legs. That's the way I hook them. They stay on the hook well. And also 9 out of 10 times, if you happen to miss a fish on crickets, they eat it head first and they'll pull the head off. So, it makes sense to have it hooked like that. Corey asked, would brim eat minnows? And they will, but it's going to be a really big brim and a pretty small minnow if they do. You just think about the size of their mouths. They're just eating a little bit smaller stuff generally. So let's move on and talk a little bit about hooks. Here's just a little bit of a diagram talking about the different parts. When I'm talking about the eye of the hook, that's where your line goes through. The shank is the main part there, and then you've got the gap or the bend of the hook. If you ever hear somebody talk about a wide gap hook, then you're talking about a wider gap, and then you've got a point and a barb. The barb is what, when it's hooked, it keeps the fish from coming right back off. Also on this same slide, on the bottom right is a worm hook. So what you have is an offset shank, and I'll show you on the next picture why I call it a worm hook or an offset hook. And it's the way you can rig your artificial bass lures weedless, and they still stay straight. Picture top right is going to be what you would use for brim or crappie, and the size is going to be determined on what you're fishing for. I know we got a question about size. I can't tell you a certain 1/0, 2/0, size 3, size 4, anything like that, because even brim fishing, it could vary depending on what you're using for bait and the different sizes of the fish. But the biggest thing is just always put the size of bait or lure with the size of hook and the size of fish. So if I'm fishing for 40-pound catfish, well, I'm probably using this big giant 10/0 hook. If I'm planning on catching 14-inch catfish, I'm going to use a hook, size of my thumb. So you really have to just kind of judge of what you're going after, and then just set your hook size to that. Real quickly, just talk a little bit about artificials. So that soft plastic worm I was talking about, you can see how that offset on that hook prior plays a factor. You thread up about 1/4 inch of that worm, and then you're able to stick the tip and the barb back into the end of it, and it makes it pretty well hang proof It's called a weedless method, and there's a ton of videos out there. But when you see hooks like that, that's what it's designed to be for. When we're talking about artificials, there is 9 billion different baits out there, but really a type of spinner bait or a crankbait is going to be great for crappie, bass, even the small ones can be used for brim. And again, they make all these different lures in so many different sizes for different species. Pictured here is a series of brim beds like I was talking about. If you were using electronic scanning, you would be able to see them. This is actually a picture taken with your naked eye. They're normally in 2 foot or less. So, you might spook the fish when you first walk up if you don't know they're there. But generally speaking, they're going to come back to these beds. So, if you're walking around the pond and you find these, you definitely want to come back, and this would be a place to target your brim. All species come up in bed. I just find that brim this is kind of the time of year when they're targeted, when they're up on their beds. For the most part, bass, different species, they do make beds and they spawn, but they're not targeted really as much as something like a brim. Other times when they're not spawning, really don't matter what species you're talking about. They're clinging to different cover, whether that be wood or docks or artificial reefs that's sank by the state agency or a personal one, stake mats, things like that. Generally what's happening here, this piece of structure will go into the water. There's going to be algae that starts to cling to it, and that's going to bring minnows, and that's going to bring other fish. It's just kind of the life cycle. Any questions so far? And then we're going to dive in a little bit about how to find places to fish, and then we'll take questions. So I'm going to go forward and I'll come back to this. So that app there that you see on the left, that's the TWRA On The Go app. You can get it on your phone. Real quickly, you can click on the boating or the fish icon, and it's going to give you a ton of information. But what you're going to find is this interactive GIS map, and you can zoom in on where you're at, and you're going to see just what you see here. You'll see all the different reservoirs. You're going to see different ownership data. And then when you zoom in to a certain reservoir, you're going to start seeing pictured there are some fish icons where there's fish attractors that was sank by the state. You're going to see anchors, the little red anchor, that's a marina. You're going to see the blue boat ramp icon, all the different access points. This is kind of a catch-all, this one map. So then once I click on a body of water, or I click on a boat ramp on a body of water, you can see here on Old Hickory, you're going to pull up all the regulations, statewide regulations. Everything can be found right there on that one app pretty quickly. So that being said, if there's a creel limit, a size limit, any kind of licensing requirements, special licensing requirements, all that can be found on that individual reservoir's icon there. And then you can also reach that at gooutdoorstennessee.com. Corey asked, what depth do catfish bed at? You got 3 different subspecies, channel, blue cat, and flatheads. That's pretty common. Channel probably being the most common. And channels this time of year, at least on Kentucky Lake where I'm familiar, they're going to go up into 4 to 8 foot of water to spawn. Some of the other species probably going to hold out a little deeper, but they're not like a brim or a bass. They can spawn in a little bit deeper water. Edward asked, how fast do all these fish grow annually? I know that the stats, depending on where you're at in America, the northern states, the fish grow slower. The southern states, they grow a little bit faster. it's just because of the water temperature and things like that. Here in Tennessee, and don't hold me to it, I'm gonna say about 2.5, 3 inches a year on a bass. So, you take a fish that's 16, 17 inches, getting up in that 4.5 pound range, he's probably gonna be about a 4 or 5-year-old fish. As for brim and crappie, it's kind of, again, speculative, but probably about about 3 or 4 inches a year would be a good guess on them as well. But there's so many variations, different rivers, different lakes, different genetics. I mean, it's really a complicated thing when you start thinking like that. Lennon asking, you fish boat ramps and docks? Yes, most all of the boat ramps that are maintained by the state, you can fish around those boat ramps or off the docks that are at them. Obviously, if it's a personally owned dock or a personally owned boat ramp, you're not going to be able to do that. But you can get the information on that GIS map and see which ones are run by the state. One last thing before you guys, while you guys are thinking about your final questions here, I love to fish, but I also love to eat fish. That's one of the biggest reasons why I do fish. And this is just a really you can do this with any of the species we've talked about. Generally, when I'm eating fish, I'm going to fillet them. And you can see kind of the method for doing that. You're cutting down behind the gills, getting against that backbone, and then you're turning the blade horizontal, and you're going to cut all the way off, come back, and trim that meat from the skin on both sides, and you're getting just a completely boneless fillet. You'll come back and cut the ribs out, but you'll be able to feel that's kind of what's pictured there on the bottom left of that cutting board. A little experience will go a long ways. There's also a ton of YouTube videos on how to fillet fish. So after I've got them filleted, I'm going to normally put a little salt on them, put them in a bowl with water, let them set overnight, and then the next day we're going to be ready to cook them. And this is me. This is the way I eat 99% of the fish that I catch. You can take 3/4 of a cup of milk and an egg. If you're really wanting the batter to stick, you can definitely get by without that. But you can take Andy's fish mix, Tony Chachere's fish mix, or just a mixture of cornmeal and flour. Add a little bit of salt and pepper to flavor. I like the fish mixes. It just seems like, it's a combination of ingredients that it would be hard for me to make on my own. We're going to get our grease 350 degrees in a deep fryer or a couple inches in a big skillet. I find that if you've got like a little Fry Daddy or something like that, it's not near as messy because you have so much more depth to work with. We're gonna dip our fillets in the egg and milk to get it where the fish mix is gonna stick to that fillet. We're gonna drop it into the grease, and then about, depending on the size of the fillets, about 5 minutes, they'll start to float and turn brown, and then you're ready to pull them out, put them on a paper towel, or just let them drain over it with your drain, and they're ready to eat. That's my favorite way of eating. Nicole asked a question. My son would like to know if the fish know the bait is a trap. Absolutely, sometimes. If you're in a place with very clear water and there's a lot of pressure, they probably get a little skeptical of things that are not real minnows. So, yep, that's a good question. All right, so the answer to our questions here, choose the type of rod and reel that would be best suited for the following scenario: casting a small 1/8 ounce jig head and a 1.5 inch swim bait for brim and crappie. We're talking about a really small bait, it's light, and I would throw a spinning reel with like a medium light rod action. And then the second, choose the type of fishing line that is strongest for its diameter. As I'd mentioned, braided fishing line is super strong per unit size. So, if we got 40 or 50, it would take about 80-pound tensile strength braided fishing line to be the same size as about a 10 or 12 pound monofilament. So it's really, really strong tensile strength for its size. I got to read Landon's joke. It said, where do fish keep its money? The riverbank. It's a good one. Thank you guys for joining. As always, feel free to send me a email with any success stories of your first fishing outing or any questions you have along the way. Just feel free to reach out.